Hello everyone, I'm Nayaswami Asha, and we are continuing our study of the essence of the Bhagavad Gita, this commentary presented by Swami Kriyananda of the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda. Many people know what a great scripture the Gita is, and for how many generations people have been reading it, and how very small it is in its essence. We have this gigantic book of commentary, and then I don't have it in my hand, but we also have this tiny little version of the Gita itself. In fact, a friend of mine was wearing a t-shirt in which the entire Gita was written front and back in Hindi. Excuse me. I was just thinking how amazing that you could put it on a t-shirt, and someone gave me a little silver necklace, and inside is a tiny little Hindi version of the Gita that you can wear all the time, presumably, if you could see it, and if you could read Hindi, which I can't, of course, that you would always have those words. It's really astonishing to contemplate, and I'm not the first one to have done so, how enduring the wisdom of this scripture is. And as a master's commentary on it is considered to be, as Swami explains it, the purpose of his commentary is that we have transitioned from Kali Yuga. We are transitioning from Kali Yuga into Dwapara Yuga. Actually, we're fully in Dwapara Yuga, but still this early years of a new Yuga are a little bit unsettled. And so the reason, excuse me, the reason why a new interpretation is needed, I'm sorry, I have to, sometimes it's morning where I'm recording this. Sometimes the pollen is very enthusiastic, and my body isn't about the conjoining of those two realities. Well, in any case, Swamiji was saying that because we're moving into a higher age, and that higher age is characterized by an understanding of the nature of the universe as energy, then it's possible to be more explicit about many aspects of what Krishna intended here. The most astonishing thing about the Bhagavad Gita, just as a testimony to the clarity of Sanatana Dharma, is how many levels and in how many ages of meaning, how many levels of meaning and how many ages of the planet this scripture has endured, and how many levels of individuals can just keep drawing from it. So what Yogananda is able to do now is, this is a very integrated interpretation. That's how Swamiji put it. He draws meaning for ordinary, everyday life as well as for the deepest level of spiritual life. Later in this book, we'll come to a certain passage where Swamiji is explaining, there's always Master's teachings, but Swamiji is explaining it, about how at the stage of being a Jivan Mukta, you can just meditate and envision, work out whatever remaining karma is left before you're completely free. And when I was reading that in the manuscript form, I was being just a little jocular with Swamiji, inappropriately. And I made some comment about how not many of us readers are going to need that particular advice. But Swami looked at me with complete seriousness, and he said, yes, but for those who do, it will be extremely helpful. And then I just appreciated one more time, which is something that always has to be renewed when you're dealing with Krishna, when you're dealing with Yogananda, and in my case, when I was in relationship with Swami Kriyananda and learning from him. You can never presume, and you can never imagine that merely because the Master is able to meet you at whatever vibration of consciousness you have, that the vibration of consciousness we have is actually the same as theirs. With Swamiji, he was talking in a different recording I was listening to the other night. And he said something, he was praying to Master, teach me to love you as you love me. And Master's response to him was, how can the cup hold the whole ocean? And Swamiji instantly understood that before he can love as Master loves, he has to become as Master is. He has to embrace infinity, because the love that the Guru gives to the disciple is infinite. There's no boundary to it, no condition, no limitation. And for us to love in the same way, we have to have the same state of consciousness. But the point of the Bhagavad Gita is that we will, and that it's just a step-by-step process that we have to work our way to. Now, where we are now is setting the stage, in a sense. This is still, we're in chapter 2 of the Gita, which is chapter 10 of the book. The nature of death, allegorical and literal, is what the book in the commentary, the chapter in the commentary is called. But what we're dealing with Arjuna is this very critical first moment, which is actually what prompts the whole response of the Gita, which is when Arjuna loses his nerve. And he loses his nerve, he becomes a little discouraged, as Swamiji talks about it in here. He's about to engage in battle, and instead he wants to contemplate what he's about to do. And so he has Krishna take him between the two forces. And he's begun to say to Krishna, which he has said, how can I fight these people, all of them dear to me? Even if they desire to slay me, I cannot commit the great sin of fighting against them. So then we have a discussion, as we started last week, about what is ahimsa. Because what happens to us, the way Swamiji described it, is that when delusion invades our consciousness, it never looks like delusion when it comes in. Of course, if it did, it would be so simple. If the devil actually dressed, as we picture him in the West, in a little red suit with horns and tails, then you would always know exactly, you would say, oh look, there's the devil, he's the one who's trying to make me do it. I'm going to digress because this is a fascinating, just little bit of odd history. I'm somebody, because blue is the color of the Nayaswamis, and we wear it all the time. Somebody gave me a book, and it was called The History of Blue. Amazing what people study and understand, but even when you stop and think about it, well, hasn't blue always been there? Well, yes, blue has always been in nature, but the technology of man learning how to reproduce blue, either in paintings or in dyeing fabric, is not something that's always been there. It was something that was coming out of Kali Yuga that was gradually discovered. So it was an academic book about the history of blue. But there were a couple of fascinating snippets in it that are amazing. Of course, blue has an inherent reality, because when you look in the spiritual eye, you see the blue field, especially that indigo blue field, and you look up to the sky and you see blue. So it's not like mankind invented it. There's a certain expansive association with the color blue. But when blue was first beginning to be invented, the dye guilds of red had a very strong materialistic interest in maintaining red as the most important color of choice. And there actually was this battle, this economic battle that was not always honorable, between those with an invested interest in red and those entrepreneurs who were pushing for blue. I mean, things never change, do they? And at a period of time, the Red Guild bribed a number of artists to paint paintings of the devil and to color him blue. And so for a short period of time, the color blue became associated with Satan, and therefore then people didn't want to be seen wearing it. Why would you want to wear the color that's associated with the devil? But then some very good artist painted the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus, in blue. And ever thereafter, Mary's been associated with blue. But once the Virgin Mary was associated with blue, the red guild lost their stranglehold, and blue began its insinuating its way into the public consciousness. What was so interesting to me when I was reading that is the fight between red and blue. And blue also went through two iterations of two sources of the dye for fabric. One of them was a plant source grown in England, and one was indigo imported, I believe from India is actually where it came from. And all the plant source of the blue was wiped out by the imported one, or maybe I have that reversed. But it was so much like the present time when, the digital ways of doing things are wiping out the old ways. In other words, things change and things never change. The more things change, the less they change, which is relevant to what I'm saying here, because human nature is human nature. And so it's not a question of when something was written, it's understanding what it actually means for us. So coming back to this, Swamiji says, Master says that Satan, meaning that aspect of creation which draws us away from the light, Satan is a true force, as Master said. He said, I used to think that Satan was just a myth. This is how Master put it. But I add my testimony to all those who have gone before me that there is a conscious force that's trying to pull us away. In our story, it's the Kauravas that they actually have weapons in their hands and they're trying to kill our spiritual aspiration. And the whole point of the Bhagavad Gita is don't think that you can just drift casually into cosmic consciousness. It's hand-to-hand combat all the way. Because when Satan, when the force that's going to take us away from the light, wants to draw us in that darkening direction, it, and I'll quote, insinuates itself into our minds by means of false reasoning. In other words, it doesn't just stand up there and look like Satan. It starts explaining to us sort of a new point of view. And this is essentially what's happened to Arjuna. It seems very reasonable to him all of a sudden that fighting this whole war is a bad idea. And he offers all these really good reasons. It's a sin to kill. It's especially a sin to kill these people who are close to me. I would rather not live at all than live with myself after doing all of this. I mean, it sounds very, very reasonable. Swamiji wrote a song in the context of the oratorio that he wrote. An oratorio is the life of Christ in music, and it's called The Temptation. And there's 4 characters. One is Jesus himself, one is the devil tempting him, and 2 are angels commenting on the scene. And the devil starts out, and if you don't really know the song, you don't really get, just from what you're hearing, that the one that's singing is the devil. And he just says to Jesus, you can have anything you want. It's very simple. You can have all the power, you can do all these different things. All you have to do is give your loyalty to me. And that loyalty is to the material world as the source of power. And Jesus, of course, looks right at that delusion and says, get thee behind me, Satan. That what I really want, the fulfillment that I'm really seeking, is going to come to me from spirit or not at all. Swamiji writes a little bit later here, and I'll skip a little bit in order to say this. He talks about how the attraction to believing that our fulfillment comes from something outside of ourselves. Swamiji explains that as a conditioned response. It's very interesting to think of it like that. He said, because the same things do not give pleasure to everyone. And so what we consider pleasurable is a learned response. Even something as self-evident as delicious food or sexual experience, which most people think is inherent, there are many people in the world who get no pleasure from that. To affirm their relationship to their body with such force, far from making them feel expanded and liberated, actually makes them feel confined. And furthermore, Swami comments that all pleasure through the senses is vicarious. It's odd when you think of it like that. He said it doesn't even take place on the surface of the body where it seems to, but the nerves, when we eat, when we touch, when we listen to something, it transmits something to the brain. And the brain then interprets what it's experiencing, and the brain then makes a decision as to whether this is pleasure or pain. And things can happen to the brain. I mean, one of the ways they discover this, things can happen to the brain so it interprets things completely differently. Or one can be conditioned by life experiences or experiences in previous incarnations that cause us to experience things very differently. When we, our temple now, here in Palo Alto where I live, is this beautiful freestanding building that was actually built by the Catholics about 60 or 70 years ago, and we purchased it from them now 20 years ago and converted it from a Catholic church into a temple of self-realization. Prior to that, before we could afford to have that building, when we were just gathering our Sangha and getting ourselves established, we rented what was really an office suite in the upstairs of an office building, and it served us very well for many years. We actually had many wonderful experiences inside that building. But when we come down from from our little temple area, and come out on the sidewalk, we were just in a business district. I mean, we still are, but we have more space around us. And across the street from us in that business district, there was a nightclub. And that nightclub would play music with such a strong, driving, sort of low-toned beat. So it's kind of like the opposite of the true Om, that it would actually vibrate through the sidewalk, through the street and to the sidewalk. And so it was across the street, but you could come outside and be standing there, and you could feel it under your feet, and you could sort of feel it in the air. You could sort of hear it, but it was almost like the sound waves were affecting us more. And on several occasions, when we'd had particularly uplifting experiences in our temple, it was a very nice temple because it was at the back of the building and there were no windows. So we were completely isolated. It was like a cave. And we didn't even know if it was day or night, so it was all artificial light. So you'd come out on occasion and be standing on the sidewalk getting ready to go home, and this completely other reality would be imposed upon you. And often you'd look over at the nightclub and crowds of people were going in, almost always dressed in black, as it happened, which did not seem incidental to my way of looking at it. But I was thinking, wow, if we invited them over to our temple, they wouldn't even be able to see it. They probably couldn't find it, and if they got in, they would think they had just arrived nowhere, because the sattvic inward quality of what was going on, it would transmit nothing to their brains. And for me to be forced into the atmosphere that they were in, well, I would quite say it would be hell, would be the actual word. I just would not be able to find any pleasure in it. Now, this is the process of the devotee's evolution, which is that we gradually have to learn on ever deeper levels what it is that, what true pleasure, what true bliss really is. And we learn it because of the way we're made. It's not really because Krishna tells us that this is true and this isn't true. It's because we've experienced it, and we've experienced it in many incarnations, and now we remember. And Swamiji raises the question here that when Arjuna begins to, well, I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but let me just finish the thought because I have skipped ahead here. By contrast, you see, the pleasure in spiritual things that we experience is not vicarious. It's actually coming in to a relationship with our own true nature. And no one has to learn to enjoy spiritual experiences, because as soon as we have them, we recognize them. Smriti is the Sanskrit word for it, which is a wonderful word. It means divine remembrance. And even the most worldly person, when he's touched by spirit, he knows that he's been touched. There's a story told about Master when he was in a hotel, and most people, of course, instinctively treated with Master with a great deal of respect. And of course, all those who knew who he was were very respectful of him. But sometimes total strangers would be drawn to him but not really have any understanding of the protocol. And in this particular instance, Master was in the lobby of a public hotel, and there was a man who was drunk. And in his drunkenness, though, somehow he could tell that Master was not an ordinary man. Maybe he could tell more clearly because his rational mind was corrupted by the drink. And so he sort of puts his arm around Master in a over-familiar manner that none of the disciples would have done. And he says, "Hello there," and he calls him Jesus Christ, because he can't quite say it because he's drunk, trying to say, "Hello there, Jesus." And Master just accepted, the man's attention. And then Master decided that there's a phrase in English, feeling no pain, which actually means that you're so drunk, you're not aware of your senses at all, you're feeling no pain. So this man was feeling no pain, and therefore in his own corrupted way, thinking that he was well off. And Master decided to give him a touch of true bliss. This man had very good karma to throw his arms around Master. So Master touched him, and suddenly not only was he sober, but he was suddenly elevated into, first he wasn't sober, but he was elevated suddenly into true spiritual bliss. And the first thing he said to Master is, "What are you drinking?" Because the experience was so different. And Master just smiled and says, "It has quite a kick to it, doesn't it?" And then he walked away and left the drunk man there. But even from his drunkenness, he could recognize it. And he knew what it was. Now, you see, this is the whole basis of the Bhagavad Gita. The whole basis of the Bhagavad Gita is telling us the reason we have to fight this battle against these delusions is because what we truly seek in fulfillment will only come to us when we do. And so nobody has an agenda here. It's not like God himself has an agenda or Krishna is rooting for the Pandavas. It's that until we fight this battle, we will always be dissatisfied. So let me just get my words here exactly. When Arjuna declares that he's not able to fight, in fact, he goes even farther and he says, "How can I enjoy any happiness? If I take these parts of myself down," this is the devotee's mind thinking, "But this is the only happiness I know. These are my people. How you're telling me that there is this spiritual fulfillment, but this is what I know." And in fact, this is a very common argument that the mind throws up. And the spiritual teaching says you have to be even-minded and cheerful, that you need to be detached, that you need to always be a little bit of the observer and never allow yourself to get carried away by the things of this world. And the mind just says, but the roller coaster is the fun of it. How can I ever be happy if I don't also understand sadness? How can it be beneficial for me to resist? We need to enter into life. We need to feel it on all levels. As Swamiji said when he was learning as a young man, and he was 18 and 19 and 20, and he was trying to become a playwright. And the mood, which has really just taken over creative work, artistic work these days, is the more gritty and sort of visceral and ugly and in the gutter, the more depraved what you're dealing with is, the more realistic it is. to the point now where much of art is deeply offensive, because it just celebrates the underside of human experience. But that's an extension of the dilemma that Arjuna was facing. This is who I am. How can I be successful? How can I be happy if I don't just participate and give in and entertain these? And this is the real question, that the devotee has to have that experience and really begin to understand sort of just how fulfilling these other realities are. Now, Arjuna is at a slightly different place here, as Swamiji explains it. He's not really longing to re-enter that world. He's not saying, I belong to the Kauravas. He's just saying, I'm a little afraid about killing them. But he's loyal to his brothers. He still understands that the spiritual life is what he wants. But he's, as Swamiji describes it, he's caught between the worlds. He can still see both sides. And it looks a little bit, he doesn't say that he's drawn to them, as Swami puts it. But the devotee can never be entirely certain. You have to always exercise a little bit of respect, even if you feel that you've overcome a desire completely. That's why you have to kill it. You have to really just take it out of your life. You can't have this sort of sentimental affection for it, which is what Arjuna is expressing here, a kind of sentimental affection for all this that he's grown up with. Like if your old drinking buddies and the girls you used to go out to the clubs with, or the way you used to wear your hair, or the drinks that you used to have, the wine you used to enjoy, the pleasure you had with your money. I mean, you have a nostalgia for this. And you think, well, I don't really have to eliminate that completely. I can just kind of let it go on and admire it from a distance. No, Krishna says you have to just completely eliminate it. But then Arjuna, and this is where the Bhagavad Gita begins to speak on many levels, Arjuna is also just raising the simple question about killing, because this scripture takes place on many levels. So now he's actually asking, and this is what we were talking about last week, about ahimsa. Isn't it wrong to kill? So the Gita also begins to answer the question on a very everyday level, which is no, there is such a thing as righteous war. I was just also reading in The Essence of Self-Realization, and it's the chapter on karma. And Master's saying exactly the same thing. He was actually being very specific. It wasn't the old war of Kurukshetra. He was at that time talking about the Korean War in the 1950s here in America and Korea. And he said it was an evil force. He said that the communists enslave people, and the necessity for a free nation to stop that evil incursion, he says, is righteous war. So now Krishna answers Arjuna on many levels in terms of war itself. And he then begins to give this exposition about life and death. I mean, what could be more central to the whole question of life, except the question of life and death? Because you see a lot of the motivation on the spiritual path, and this whole section of what Krishna is doing is he's explaining to us why we have to fight. It's called the Sankhya philosophy, they call it, but it's the why of the spiritual path. Why do we have to engage in this battle at all? And so Krishna is explaining to us that everything in this world is ephemeral. And we imagine that it will remain fixed, but it won't remain fixed, it just fades away. And everyone discovers that. I mean, every physical incarnation ends in physical death. That's just what happens. And all of the aspects of the material world that we have become conditioned to believe are the source of our happiness, sooner or later, they all go away. And the jiva, the individual consciousness continues from one incarnation to the next. And it remembers. It remembers disappointment. It remembers having everything I wanted and yet still not feeling fulfilled. It's the river in search of the sea. It's the bubble trying to merge into the infinite. And so when Arjuna asks, why should I make this effort? And the effort is to battle against the Kauravas, his evil cousins, and the effort also is to string the bow, which is to straighten the spine in meditation and to concentrate and send the arrows of your concentration right through the spiritual eye. Why should I bother? Arjuna is asking, wouldn't it be better just to live and let live and just have a normal, easy life like everyone else? I'm smiling because I remember there were two women who were raised in our community. Not all the children who grow up within Ananda embrace this as a spiritual path. Every soul has its own freedom, and its spiritual karma may be only in its childhood, and then it goes on to other necessary lessons. So both of these women, by the time the story takes place, are in their 30s, maybe even 40. And even though they haven't become devotees, the values of the spiritual path are still many of the values are still deeply in them. And one of them was overheard to say to the other, all our friends, meeting our friends who weren't raised at Ananda, who just live their lives by material values, they can just do anything they want. They're not bound by these deeper truths. And then one friend laments to the other, but yes, we always have to think of the deeper meaning of everything we do. And they were lamenting that they were trapped by their upbringing. But what we're really trapped by is our own samskars, our own recollection that if we live against our true nature, then unhappiness ensues. So Krishna starts explaining to Arjuna, first on the most obvious level. He says, when you think that when you kill the bodies here, when you remove the soul from the body by making the body uninhabitable, by killing it with your weapons, you think that you've actually ended something. He said, and Krishna puts it like this, you see the body fall to the ground, but Krishna says, I see the soul rise up to the astral world. And so you think something has been ended, but I perceive that something is just going on. Master said it once in the most interesting way. He said, when a baby is born in this world, in the material world, everyone is so thrilled that this material life is beginning and this child has come. And he said, so we celebrate, we're so happy. And in the astral world, it's a funeral. Because a dear friend, for all those to whom this soul is a dear friend, he's been living a life with us in the astral world, and now his karma has taken him back to the material world, so we're losing his company. And then when a soul dies on the material plane, and the body falls away, and Krishna sees that spirit going back to the astral world. In the astral world, it's a welcome home party. And here we're crying and so sad because we've lost our friend. And in the astral world, they say, oh, you've returned, you've returned. A friend of mine had what they call Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS, which is a degenerative disorder. And it takes your life slowly. It's a bit of a challenging death. And my friend took it extremely courageously. And on the very last 24 hours of his life, he was on oxygen, and the oxygen tank ran out, and his caregivers hadn't noticed, so he went very far toward the end of his life. But then when they turned on the oxygen again, it wasn't quite his time. He was a very free-spirited and very natural man, very spontaneous person. He was very unpretentious, that's the word I want to use. And he had a really good attitude. He was a builder, and he was just a strong, natural fellow. And he said, when he explained when he went off into that almost death, he said he got up into another realm, and he said there was a big party going on. And he was all ready to go in the door and join the party. But when he just got to the door, they pointed out that it was a costume party, and he didn't have the right costume on. And so he wasn't going to be able to get into the party. And so he said he just stood in the hall and partied by himself. And then he got drawn back into his physical body and became aware of this world again. Well, it was so obvious. He was still connected to his material body, so he could see it, but he couldn't quite enter it yet because he didn't have the right costume. He was still wearing his physical body too much. And then it's presumed, of course, when his physical body did fall away, which was not much later, merely hours later, we all love the idea that he got right to that door of that party and they took him right in. It was the welcome home party. He was gone from this world and welcomed into that world. So Krishna explains this, and he also explains to Arjuna, all of us have lived many lives. So these verses of chapter 2 of the Gita are really just setting the stage for this. That which appears to die doesn't really die. It just transitions from one form to the next. It's not liberated in the sense that merely taking off a physical body does not free us from the ego. The ego, which is the jiva, the individual spark of spirit, identified with all this karma and this limited consciousness, exists on the material plane, on the astral plane, and even in a very subtle form on the causal plane. So it's not really like merely taking off the body liberates you in a spiritual sense, but it just allows you to move for a time into another realm. It doesn't annihilate us. So what Krishna is trying to explain to Arjuna, which is extremely important, is he said, this is the reality, that a greater self inhabits this body. This body does not create the greater self. The greater self creates the body, and it wears it for a while, and it wears it literally like clothes that you buy. And you wear it till it's worn out. Or perhaps if your body is taken away when you're young, until it no longer serves you. It's a very important part of spiritual understanding to realize that the body does not control the destiny. The soul, the jiva, controls the body. And the body exists and is manifested with the life force of the soul for exactly as long as it serves the expanding consciousness of the jiva to be wearing it. And the moment it ceases to exist, it's like a uniform of a particular social order. It's like our clothes are like a uniform we wear that identifies us as belonging in a certain context and gives us certain rights and privileges and understandings. And at the point at which that uniform, that way of defining ourselves doesn't serve us, we literally just look at it and say, why am I wearing this? And we just take it off. Whether that happens to a young child who just exits from his body, an old man, someone in middle life, whether that death comes through illness or suddenly, we just suddenly realize this doesn't serve me anymore. So Krishna is explaining to Arjuna, your excessive sensitivity about playing a role in the removal of this outworn garment to be the instrument at the moment when that garment will be removed, this is not wisdom for you to be thinking like this. This is not really an expanded concern for the welfare of others. This is a complete confusion as to why you are here at all. So then Krishna talks about the context, the external context. This is a righteous war. And these Kauravas have been behaving in an evil manner. And the responsibility and the duty given to you is to be a soldier. You are a soldier. Now, of course, we're all soldiers in a spiritual sense, and this is where the allegory and the history kind of become involved, but you can look at it from both sides. Much has been invested in you, Arjuna, and all those who are depending on you, not merely your brothers, but all of the citizens of this kingdom whose welfare depends on your action. And you're going to let them all down? You're going to disappoint them? You're just going to casually throw aside their interests on this whim of yours? And Krishna says this is not appropriate behavior for a kshatriya. And then he says your reputation will be destroyed. No one will respect you. They will all call you a coward. You will never be able to hold your head up again. People will speak of you with scorn. Now, it's not so much that Krishna is concerned about public opinion, but he's just trying to say that nothing good, nothing that you think will come to you will come to you. If you allow this evil to exist unchallenged, you will not find in doing so the fulfillment you seek. And so he characterizes it as the duty of a kshatriya to fight. And in this sense also he's talking about external duty, when the responsibility of correcting a wrong situation is there. He says we have to face it. And then he speaks of it. He said, even if you lose your life, if you lose your life in an effort to live righteously according to high principles, then he says you'll go to the heaven reserved for brave soldiers. And it's just an allegorical way of saying it, because Arjuna is not looking to go to the heaven reserved for brave soldiers. But Krishna is also talking about karma here. If you do what is right, there will be a righteous result. Whether that righteous result is your external victory or your internal victory, there will be a righteous result. This is, in truth, what Krishna is saying here, is where there is dharma, there is always victory. And dharma means those actions which expand consciousness. Your dharma is to do that which expands your consciousness. It's not merely duty in any external sense. And dharma is definitely not defined by society. Your dharma is that which expands your consciousness. And so if you do that which expands your consciousness, the result will always be victory, even if you yourself die. There's a series of books, which I'm not really going to recommend them. They're light entertainment, and some of them are better than others, by an author named Taylor Caldwell. She was quite popular some years ago. I don't think she enjoys the same popularity. And she rather openly said that many of her books, because they were all written in they were historical novels. Sometimes she would take real characters and make a novel out of what she imagined their lives to be. Sometimes she would just make up characters. And often her characters were brave, unconventional females who defied everything and then did the right thing. And it was fine. She was writing her autobiography in many forms. And in fact, she said that she called some of her books, she called it far memory, meaning memories of past lives. And there was one story which I read which was actually very interesting in this sense. It was a story about some young people who were taken as slaves in some very less enlightened age. And then they were used as entertainment because unarmed young people had to face ferocious animals. In this case, it was raging bulls. It wasn't like tigers and lions, but it was bulls. And they had to try without weapons, but mostly by acrobatics, to be able to jump over the bull or jump onto it and then off of it without getting gored. And very bloodthirsty sport, and many times they would die. So the story of this young girl was all her efforts to train in order to face that bull. And the way the story went, she did all her training, and most of it for her was she was absolutely terrified, as you can well imagine, of the day when she would have to face the bull. But when she finally did have to face the bull, some greater power came into her, and she was absolutely fearless. She was completely attuned to a greater reality, saw herself, saw the bull, saw all the bloodthirsty patrons, all of it. It was all just a play of light and shadow. And very courageously she went forward and faced this raging bull and was gored to death and died. But the way the story was told, it was a great, victorious life. Because the entire purpose of that life was to overcome her fear, which she did. And as soon as she overcame her fear, she didn't have to triumph in the game they were playing. She had fulfilled the purpose of that physical body. And then she was able to go forward. Now, this is what Krishna is trying to explain to Arjuna, that you simply have to do the right thing. And if you do the right thing, everything else will take care of itself. And there is no doubt in this moment that this is the right thing. So, what Krishna is also doing in this whole chapter, which is what I'm saying here, is he's explaining why we should fight. Because the only way that victory will come to us is through right action. So, now let me see what else we have here. Okay, so now we get out of, now Krishna has done the explaining of the why, the three parts of spiritual practice, and every one as important as the other. Is the first part is the Sankhya philosophy, the second part is yoga, and the third part is Vedanta. And Master explains that in the course of the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna covers all these parts. And the why of the spiritual path, obviously it comes first, and it comes first for this reason also. If the devotee does not, with every ounce of himself, understand what he's doing and why, the how of it is irrelevant. Because if you're not fully motivated to do it, you won't do it. And that's what all of us have to work with in ourselves. And Arjuna, the battle is never fully won. And that's what Arjuna expresses to us here. Arjuna knows why he's doing this, and the outward battle becomes the issue of the powerful illustration, the allegory. When you read the whole Mahabharata, the lengths to which the Pandavas go to avoid this battle are so extreme. And everything that happens is so extreme that brings them right to the edge of this battlefield. And still, after all of that, Arjuna questions. And what he's representing is the fact that the devotee, even though you're absolutely certain, every so often weakness comes in. And we have to appeal to God to save us from that weakness. We stand between the two armies. We survey the world that we've left behind. We look toward the spiritual world where we're going, and we lose heart. Now, Swamiji explains that Arjuna didn't exactly express longing for the worldly life, but he was discouraged in his effort to achieve the spiritual. That's how Swami puts it. He became discouraged. And there is this point where it's not so much that we want to go back to the world, it's that we've made a great deal of effort and we still haven't gotten what we think we should have. And this is a very dangerous and difficult point on the spiritual path, which all devotees have to be prepared to face and go through. I don't mean to be frivolous about this, but earlier in my spiritual life I coined a phrase for this, because when my first 10 years as a devotee, I lived at Ananda village in the rural community under very simple conditions, bordering on primitive, but let's use the word simple. We were utterly impoverished. We had almost no money. We never never went shopping, never bought anything. I was reading recently in some of the community newsletters and things from those very early years, from the 1970s. The garden group was asking people to save the twist ties from loaves of bread and to turn them into the garden so that they could use them to reclose the plastic bags in which they put the garden vegetables. Now, I started thinking to myself, I mean, that's a tiny little piece of wire. You can't even quantify how little money that costs, but everything to us was that precious that they needed to have people save them and turn them back in again. And somebody was needing a watch, and we're advertising, does anybody have an extra watch? The idea that you could go out and actually buy a watch was just outside the realm of possibility for us. And certainly, if you could avoid spending money on anything, money was the hardest thing to come by in those days. Happiness was not at all hard to come by. Spiritual joy was easy to come by. Money was harder to come by, but it really didn't matter to us at all. And many of us embraced the monastic life in those first years, and I was one of them. And during that first decade, I lived in close association with a small group of women. We had a little monastery there, and it was really a wonderful way of life. But we jumped in rather naively, is the only way I can put it, in the wild enthusiasm of finding this community, finding Swamiji, finding Master and the spiritual path. We just jumped in. We just jumped in and started swimming. We could see the island of bliss in the distance. We were so happy to get off of the shore of meaningless life, and we were just in the water, and we started swimming. And 5, 6, 7 years into it. And understand, this was meant humorously, but it was in order to buoy our spirits that I was making jokes. It was like we had swum too far out from shore to turn around and go back. You know, you commit yourself to a certain point, and you can't just say, oh, I'm sorry, I don't want to do this, because it's going to take as much energy or more to get back to where you came from. It's just really not an option. But we were a lot farther from that island of bliss. It was a lot farther to that island of bliss than we thought it was when we jumped in the water. So we were too far out to turn back, and not close enough to our goal to sort of make that final push. And we were treading water, discussing it among ourselves, and growing tired. That's what was happening. And I began to characterize that stage on the spiritual path. I called it the icky middle. You really can't go back to worldliness, and you don't have as much of spirit as you thought you might at this stage. When I first heard about meditation, I learned about it when I was 19. I remember Master talking at some point about a portable paradise that you carried within you. I've always loved that phrase, your portable paradise, that no matter where you are, you can just enter your portable paradise. And I remember thinking vaguely, 3, 5 years, I'll be there. And then, of course, 3, 5 years come. And it's not that you're nowhere at all. I mean, one progresses enormously, and I feel every day on the spiritual path has brought some blessing and made that day better than the day before. There's no thought that I would ever give up. And when Swamiji's talking here about Arjuna, there's no indication that he really is going to go over to the Kaurava side. It's not even that he's longing. He's not longing for what they have. He's just a little discouraged, because in order to gain control of the kingdom for himself and his brothers, he's going to have to go through this icky middle of actually going to war against the people he was raised with. And that's where we often stand. We're all discouraged. We get just a little bit discouraged. And so Krishna, who is, as Swamiji says, the voice of God within us, comes to console him. Don't give up, Arjuna. Stick with it. You'll see. And he starts by reminding Arjuna in these first stanzas, in which he's talking about the true nature of the world, and that how you're lamenting, Krishna says, for that which should not be mourned. Now there's an allegory also here, symbolically, all of the Kauravas represent the materialistic qualities of Arjuna himself, of the devotee. And what Krishna is explaining when he says that these warriors are not killed, they're transmuted, which is to say the energy that you used to put into your worldly pursuits, into your sense pleasures, into the pursuit of realities that will not in the end satisfy you in the way that you had hoped, that energy is just liberated. That energy is liberated for more fulfilling pursuits. Oftentimes the devotee discovers, the more he meditates, the more you do energization, the more you follow these practices, that you find a great increase in energy. The more we don't dissipate our energy. I mean, simple things, you change your diet. You learn to breathe properly. You let go of negative attitudes. You become more hopeful about the nature of life itself. You begin to forge truer and more meaningful relationships with people who share your values. You put yourself in more positive environments. And those qualities are killed. Those qualities are taken away that used to drag your energy down, and now all this energy is freed for your positive pursuits. It's transmuted, it's not lost. You don't become less, you become more. And so Krishna is reminding Arjuna, why are you on the path at all? Why are you doing this? And Swami Kriyananda has often told us that one of the secrets to success on the spiritual path is to keep ever clearly before you why you are doing this, what you're doing and why you're doing it. To remember why you came on the spiritual path in the first place and what it felt like. What despair and unhappiness it eased to become a devotee. Service and serving others by sharing the spiritual path has always been a very important part. And when Krishna speaks later about the yoga aspect of the spiritual path, not only the why, but the how, which is what yoga is, he talks about karma yoga, about serving others. But one of the ways in my own life that I count myself fortunate that my spiritual enthusiasm has remained undiminished since the very beginning is the fact that I've had the opportunity constantly to serve others who are coming on to the spiritual path. And the contrast between not understanding the purpose and meaning of life and the dawning awakening to the implications of the spiritual path is constantly being acted out in front of me. And interestingly, Master was very enthusiastic about all devotees constantly sharing the spiritual path with all those who would listen. In some of his early writings, for example, he talks about buy many copies of Autobiography of a Yogi. And I think in some place even says, you should have a certain goal. You should give away a certain number of autobiography, the copies of this book. Every month, you should give away this many copies of this book. I was talking to a friend recently, and she was just saying she buys the book by the case, and then after a short period of time, they're all gone again. Just in the natural course of her life, without being inappropriate, she's always eager to tell other people and to bring them onto the path. Well, that's good karma. And it's also good karma in this sense, because when people do become enthusiastic about this, you see it again. You see yourself again, and through their words, and in your heart and in your mind, you hear it. This is why I'm on the spiritual path. And then it's not so hard to keep swimming, because really you look back and you don't really want to be there anymore. You want to be exactly where you are. And this is the consolation, as this next chapter is called in the commentary. Krishna's consolation. He's explaining to Arjuna, look, don't be discouraged. This is what's happening here. And if you persevere in this right way, then everything that you're seeking will be given to you. And as Krishna speaks to Arjuna, so the divine is speaking to all of us. God bless you.